This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you very much. I'll simply exceed as time is short. So I'm delighted and honoured to be contributing to this excellent occasion. I first came to know of Heythrop College in the late 1970s and early 80s when I was a philosophy student here in London, at which time Heythrop was housed behind the elegant neo-Palladian facade of Cavendish Square, which many of you will remember. During part of that period, the chairman of the governors was the philosopher David Hamlin, who also supervised my PhD thesis. Knowing that I'd been educated by the Jesuits, he would occasionally speak to me about Heythrop, expressing admiration for Frederick Copleston's work in effecting the transition of the college from a religious house of higher studies, specifically a Jesuit scholastica, and then Pontifical Athenaeum, to its identity as a constituent school of the University of London. This regard was reciprocal, for in his Memoirs of the Philosopher, Father Copleston writes of his gratitude to Hamlin, saying, for his interest, thanking him for his interest, for acknowledging his interest in the fledgling college, and for the way in which, as chairman of the governing body, he helped to guide Heythrop through its first years. I knew Hamlin very well, and Copleston only by slight acquaintance, but I've no doubt that both, having worked together to ensure a secure relationship between the college and the university, would be pleased to see this 400th anniversary celebration taking place here in the Senate House in Heythrop's fifth decade as a constituent college of London University, and I congratulate it on that account. Well, one might well have supposed that the theme of my lecture has been the subject of a book, but unless I've missed it, no such work has yet been written. And interestingly, even Copleston, who would have been better qualified than anyone, I suppose, to do so, never took on that task. The explanation of this absence is in part, I think, the scale of the theme, but also perhaps certain questions about the title, questions which that title is likely to prompt. The Jesuit contribution? Was there a singular and determinate input, be it over an extended period? Well, no one familiar with intellectual history, with the plurality of Jesuit thought and the diversity of cultures within which Jesuits have worked, would really think this could be so. Should one then speak instead of some Jesuit contributions? Well, certainly I shall consider some, but the challenge, I think, to look for some kind of unity of purpose or method or approach, if not a unitary doctrine, should, I think, be addressed. Well, thinking about Jesuit contributions to philosophy, it's natural to point to original writings, such as the Disputationes Metaphysicae of the Spaniard Francisco Suarez. There he is. By the way, most people in these portraits we're going to see look pretty miserable, but I think that's just the conventions of portraiture in the period. Suarez. The Disputations is a work of great intellectual depth and complexity, regarded on the continent in the period following its publication in 1597 as the most important treatise on metaphysics since Aristotle. Something of its influence can be detected in the great rationalist trinity, Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, which is perhaps not so surprising given that they too were interested in the same set of metaphysical issues about substance and attribute, individuation and identity, modality and causality, though they each came to rather different, in the case of the rationalists, quite revisionary conclusions about them. Suarez, however, is more commonly cited in relation to moral and political philosophy, as advocating a form of natural law theory which had greater influence in Protestant than in Catholic circles, on account of its emphasis on the idea that natural law required a divine legislator, who alone could determine its obligatoriness. Although he cited and discussed Aquinas' treatment of natural law in Summa Theologiae, his own quasi-voluntaristic position stands at some distance from Thomas. But it suited the emphasis on divine sovereignty in Calvin And Suarez's view that the law that regulates behavior between nations is customary rather than derivable a priori was also well received by those who sought to oppose what they regarded as the tyranny of Catholic secular power. These notions had a marked influence on reformed jurists such as Grotius and Pufendorf. And the argument can be made, I think, that Suarez is the father of normative international relations theory. The acknowledgement of Suarez as a moral philosopher of importance and influence is appropriate, but it omits the metaphysics. Yet many of Suarez's ideas and arguments in the field of speculative philosophy are of enduring value as engaging issues not adequately resolved by his scholastic predecessors, and which are again salient in present-day metaphysics. His eclipse might be attributed to political factors such as that he was called upon to engage in religious polemics. But subsequent history also turned against his country, Spain, so that it was easy to darken his reputation by putting it in the shadow of what has been called the Black Legend. Indeed, the political, cultural, and economic rise of Northern Europe over the Mediterranean powers may be a factor in the general minimalizing of Catholic and specifically Jesuit thought in the period from the early 17th century onwards. Attitudes, of course, have modified, but that change came too late. For in the period when philosophy expanded, it also turned against metaphysics. And the more recent return has been mostly in a historical and historically uninformed mode. There's also the fact that René Descartes, who may have been directly acquainted with the disputations, made fundamental innovations in the philosophy of substance, which rendered the earlier scholastic views, of which Suarez's disputations are a brilliant synthesis, rendered them seeming not only superseded, but entirely misconceived. Now, Descartes, of course, had been schooled by the Jesuits at La Flèche, and is probably the greatest philosopher to have had a Jesuit education. Others, however, included Mersenne, see here on the left, who was mentioned earlier. Looking, strikes me a little like John McDaid, those who know John McDaid. Mersenne, also a product of La Flèche. Vico, who we have there on the right. Diderot, Condorcet, Teilhard de Chardin, and Heidegger. Interestingly, I've selected these images for various purposes, the different portrait styles as we pass through the centuries. This one is rather extraordinary, this pair, actually, because Teilhard de Chardin looks, to put it frankly, spaced out. And Heidegger, I think, is, these are the licking flames of hell that are surrounding him. And then, however, we continue to Foucault and Bernard Lonergan, both rendered here in nice pencil sketches. Mersenne, like Descartes, was a convert to the new science, writing in defense of Galileo, not only with respect to Galileo's cosmology, but with regard to his account of the nature of natural substance, as composed of particles possessed only of geometrical and dynamic features. He's particularly interesting in this regard, for unlike Descartes, who seems to have rejected the scholastic Aristotelianism taught at La Flèche pretty much from the point at which he reflected on it, Mersenne began as a defender of that metaphysics, but during the decade 1620s to 1630, converted to the new philosophy of nature, which was effectively physics. His work was known to, and must, I think, have been admired by, the great Croatian Jesuit mathematician, astronomer, and physicist, whom we've heard already, Roger Boskovic, here gracing a Croatian banknote, who was also Jesuit educated in Dubrovnik. Beginning in 1745, Boskovic disseminated a somewhat Cartesian view of bodies as exhibiting interpenetrability, and proceeded from this exclusionary force conception to advance theoretical proof of the nature of body as consisting of discontinuous, indivisible points, arrayed in a field defined by the forces between them. A version of field theory that is still regarded with some respect for its brilliance and innovation in the period. It's a significant reflection, I think, of the capacity of Jesuit thinkers to engage and often adopt the ideas of a given period, a habit which some may view as accommodationism, but of which I'll give a different account later. That less than, it's evidence of this, or a reflection of this, that less than a century after Mersenne had taken issue with the Aristotelian metaphysics of his teachers, which was then also being taught at the Collegium Romanum, Boskovic was presenting his own version of the new science of bodies at that institution, quickly becoming its acknowledged presiding genius and securing a professorship in 1740. Well, it may seem at this point that I've strayed from metaphysics to science, or from speculative to natural philosophy. But as perhaps may be surmised from the brief description I've given of Boscovic's atomism, it was a highly theoretical account, arrived at not by experiment but by abstract reflection. And just as there are connections with Descartes' account of the body as defined by exclusive extension, so there are parallels between Boscovic's theory of atoms and Leibniz's monadology, about which we can now say nothing for reasons of time. It will not have gone unnoticed, however, that this short history, thus far, from one Jesuit, Suarez, to another, Boscovic, has involved a reversal in the fortunes of the kind of metaphysics advanced by the former, a metaphysics broadly continuous with that of the great medieval thinkers, such as Aquinas, Scotus, and Occam, all of whom were taken account of in Suarez's development of theistic Aristotelianism. Certainly, there remains a continuity inasmuch as Descartes, Mersenne, and Boscovic were all taught in Jesuit colleges. But might it not be better to see that fact as at best incidental and certainly no tribute to Jesuit philosophy per se? Well, I've already given reason to be sceptical about the idea of there being a Jesuit philosophy as such, though it's certainly true that for periods in the history of the order, in the society, I should say, in the 16th and 17th centuries, and again the 19th and 20th, it's been associated with the defense of Thomism. But to see why one may yet view the history I've sketched as a tribute to the Jesuit engagement with philosophy, it's useful to return to where this excursus began, namely with Descartes. In his, and there is La Flèche, where he was a pupil. I'm just going to read this passage fairly quickly. It's nothing tricky in it. In his discourse on method, he writes of his Jesuit education as follows. At La Flèche, I found myself involved in so many doubts and errors that I was convinced I'd advanced no further in all my attempts at learning. Then the discovery of every turn, no further in my attempts at learning than the discovery at every turn of my own ignorance. And yet I was studying in one of the most celebrated schools in Europe, in which I thought there must be learned men, if such were anywhere to be found. I had been taught all that others learned there. I still continued, however, to hold in esteem the studies of the schools. I was aware that the languages taught in them are necessary to the understanding of the writings of the ancients, that the grace of fables stirs the mind, that the memorable deeds of history elevate it, and, if read with discretion, aid in forming the judgment, that the perusal of all excellent books is, as it were, to interview the noblest men of past ages who have written them, and even a studied interview in which are discovered to us only their choicest thoughts. That eloquence has incomparable force and beauty, that poesy has its ravished graces and delights, that philosophy affords the means of discoursing with an appearance of truth on all matters, and commands the admiration of the more simple. But I had become aware, he continues, even so early as during my college life, that no opinion, however absurd and incredible, can be imagined which has not been maintained by someone of the philosophers. Now, these remarks at the beginning of the discourse have been taken to amount to a rejection and even a denigration of Jesuit education as represented by what was on offer at the Fleche. But that neglects the fact that Descartes was wanting in the discourse to establish his own originality and present himself as independent of conventional teaching, particularly as that was associated with a group that was, as I said, under the shadow of Northern European anti-Catholic propaganda. A truer picture of his attitude towards his education may be revealed in a letter written the following year to a correspondent who had sought Descartes' advice about his son's education. Descartes replies as follows: "There is no place on earth where philosophy is better taught than at La Fleche. And because philosophy is the key to the other sciences, it is extremely useful to have studied the whole philosophy curriculum in the manner it is taught in Jesuit institutions, before undertaking to raise one's mind above pedantry in order to make oneself wise in the right kind of philosophy." Now, I think we may take this second passage not as a refutation of the first, but as providing a lens through which to view it. Descartes could be entirely sincere and probably quite accurate in saying that a Jesuit education in philosophy was the best to be had, while yet thinking that the philosophy that was advocated among those presented, namely scholastic Aristotelianism, had had its day. The other First Division philosopher who spent some time at La Fleche, though only visiting the college for the purpose of using its excellent library, was the great Scottish philosopher David Hume. To judge from his comments, however, the only contribution of the Jesuits of La Fleche to his philosophy was to provide grist to his scepticism. In a letter to the philosopher and Presbyterian minister George Campbell, Hume wrote about the circumstances in which he first conceived his famous sceptical argument against miracles. He writes, "I was walking in the cloisters of the Jesuits' College of La Fleche, a town in which I passed 2 years of my youth, and engaged in a conversation with a Jesuit of some parts of learning, who was relating to me and urging some nonsensical miracle performed in their convent, when I was tempted to dispute against him. This argument immediately occurred to me, and I thought it very much gravelled my companion. But at last he observed to me that it was impossible for that argument to have any solidity, because it operated equally against the gospel as against the Catholic miracles, which observation I thought proper to admit as a sufficient answer." There we hear Hume's irony. That quotation continues, but I won't read more of it now. This isn't the occasion to discuss the philosophical issues that were before his mind then, but I note just 2 points. First, Hume's willingness to play upon the familiar Protestant prejudices about Catholic superstition and Jesuit sophistry. And second, the fact that he appears never to have troubled to consult the account of the nature of miracles, typically advanced in Jesuit presentations, which draws from Aquinas' discussion in Summa Theologiae Prima Pars, question 110, and is quite distinct from the conception against which Hume's famous argument is directed. This was not untypical of Hume to be exploitative of his setting and careless. As regards Descartes' remark about nothing being so absurd but that some philosopher has advanced it, this is in effect a quotation from Cicero's De Divinatione. Quotation, "Nothing so absurd can be said that some philosopher had not said it." Since Descartes would almost certainly have read this with the Jesuits, one wonders whether his remark is an acknowledgement of that introduction or an ironic and pointed tu quoque. There is also a resonance between his prior ironic remark that, again I quote, "Philosophy affords the means of discoursing with an appearance of truth on all matters and commands the admiration of the more simple." There is a resonance between that and a disparaging comment by Wittgenstein, who asks, "What is the use of studying philosophy if all that it does for you is enable you to talk with some plausibility about some abstruse questions of logic," and so on. Well, mention of Wittgenstein raises the question, was he influenced by Jesuit thinkers? The only remarks I know of by him concerning a Jesuit philosopher are not flattering. It was reported by Wittgenstein's sometime student and friend, Maurice O'Connor Drury, that when he, Drury, reported hearing in 1949 that A.J. Ayer and Frederick Copleston were to have a radio discussion on the existence of God, Wittgenstein laughed and said, "Oh, we mustn't miss that. Ayer discussing with a Jesuit. That would be too much to miss." In fact, the assigned, Drury just got his dates wrong here in the occasion wrong. The assigned subject of the debate was not the existence of God, but logical positivism, while the theme of the existence of God had been the subject of the famous debate Copleston had with Russell on the BBC the previous year. As I say, this gives reason to think that Drury may have confused the episodes, and that the subsequent remark he quotes, which I'm about to quote myself, in fact refers to Russell, not Ayer. At any rate, when listening to the broadcast in total silence, Wittgenstein's mood became more serious. At the end he observed, "Ayer has something to say, but he is incredibly shallow." Father Copleston contributed nothing at all to the discussion. There's also a letter from Wittgenstein from the 14th of June 1949 in which he writes, "Yesterday I listened at the radio to part of a discussion between Professor Ayer and a Jesuit about logical positivism. I stood 40 minutes of it." Well, I'll return to Copleston later. Ironically, however, and by the way, this is Copleston and Russell, and then Copleston and Ayer. That's not from the occasion of the debate. Ironically, however, admirers of Wittgenstein have reason to be grateful to two Jesuit philosophers, for in one case making his thoughts available and in the other attempting to make some initial sense of them. I'm referring here to the Irish Jesuit Cyril Barrett, who edited Ludwig Wittgenstein's Lectures and Conversations on Aesthetics, Psychology and Religious Belief, published in 1967, and to the American Garth Hallett, author of a companion to Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, published a decade later. Hallett taught at the Gregorian, where he'd also studied with Copleston and Lonergan, before returning to the US, to Detroit and then St. Louis. The appearance of the Lectures and Conversations transformed the image of Wittgenstein, revealing him to be familiar with and exercised by issues in art, psychoanalysis, and religion. To that point, it was not generally known that the great philosopher knew of, let alone cared greatly about, the thoughts of Cardinal Newman or the therapeutic methods of Sigmund Freud. It's very much to Cyril Barrett's credit, therefore, that he was able to persuade some of Wittgenstein's students to allow him to edit this material for publication. No doubt his success in this regard owed much to his Celtic charm, personal confidence and considerable knowledge of the areas in question, additional to philosophy itself. Seeking more direct examples of Jesuit contributions, one would naturally look first to a slightly earlier period than Suarez and to the commentaries on classics of Christian Aristotelianism, such as the lectures on Aquinas' Summa Theologiae given in the Collegium Romanum by Francisco de Toledo, or those on the same text given at the Portuguese universities of Coimbra and Évora by Luis de Molina, we see here on the left, who of course is better known for his theory of how to reconcile the doctrines of divine foreknowledge, predestination, grace, and free will. The Jesuit contribution to the development of Thomism in the 16th century owes much to the integration of the study of his major writings, principally the Summa, in the syllabuses of Jesuit programs of study, the most systematic and determinate of which, with regard to the study of Aquinas, is that set out in the Disposition and Order of Studies, written in 1552 by Nadal, who'd known Ignatius Loyola and the other original members of the Society when they were students at the University of Paris together. Moving from the period of late scholastic Thomism to that of the 19th century, Neo-Thomist revival, it's the 19th century Neo-Thomist revival, Jesuits are again major figures in shaping and advancing the recovery and application of Aquinas. In Italy, Serafino Sordi taught at the Jesuit College of Modena and wrote Thomistic manuals that continue to be printed up to the end of the Second World War. His dates are 1793 to 1865, so in the 1850s he was writing manuals that would survive for 100 years. Among his students was Giuseppe Pecci, older brother of Vincenzo, who would later become Leo XIII. The brothers had previously been students together at the Collegium Romanum, though only Giuseppe entered the Society of Jesus. As Pope, with the advice and support of Giuseppe, Leo advanced the position of Thomism as the favoured philosophical handmaiden of Catholic theology. In 1879, famously, he issued the encyclical Aeterni Patris, establishing the Pontifical Academy of Thomas Aquinas, and also commissioned a critical edition of Thomas's writings, the famous Leonine edition. The main Jesuit contribution to Aeterni Patris itself, however, was that of the German Jesuit Joseph Kleutgen, who wrote the first draft of the encyclical, which led directly to the development of modern Neo-Thomism and established the general standing of Aquinas as the philosopher of Catholicism. In the 20th century, however, Jesuits with an interest in Aquinas began to reinterpret his ideas within the framework of modern and recent philosophies, which they judged made simple restatements no longer adequate, acceptable, or even intelligible. Thomism had to be adapted or abandoned. Those who didn't simply set Aquinas aside sought to show that on suitable reinterpretation he could be squared with what the world of philosophy in general regarded as important and permanent insights, such as the historically conditioned and developmental character of thought and human subjectivity as proposed by Hegel and taken up in one form by Teilhard de Chardin, and the idea that experience of the world is mediated via forms of sensibility and categories of thought presupposed to particular conceptions, as argued for by Kant and developed a la Thomas by such prominent figures as Joseph Marischal and Bernard Lonergan, a sometime Heythrop student. These remarks concern Jesuits in relation to Aquinas, but as the earlier discussion of Boscovich indicated, Aquinas was not always in favour, and at times scholastic Aristotelianism in general was set aside, if not actually repudiated. The period of the late 17th and early 18th centuries does not get much discussion in the history of Catholic philosophical thought. It was, as we've heard earlier, a difficult time for the Church, and by stages for religion more generally, with the spirit of enlightenment becoming increasingly secular and even anti-religious. It was also, again as we've heard, to be a difficult time for the Jesuits, which was suppressed by in Portugal in 1759 and in France in 1762, with the subsequent sale of the contents of the library of the premier Jesuit academy, the Collège Louis le Grand, in the sale of the contents and dispersal of their contents. In 1767 came the expulsion from the Spanish Empire, and in 1773 they were suppressed in Poland, Lithuania, where a Scottish Jesuit and a St Andrews graduate, I'm happy to say, John Hay, in the 16th century, had applied a Scotist rather than a Thomist understanding and had established the School of Philosophy there in Vilnius and served as the university's first librarian. And that year, 1773, was also the year of their papal suppression by Clement XIV. Notwithstanding secular, intellectual, political, and then ecclesial pressures, however, through the late 17th and 18th century, Jesuits continued to contribute to the work of philosophy. We saw earlier Boscovich's course in the direction of scientific philosophy, but a lesser known figure whose field was more traditional was Claude Bouffier. Bouffier, 1661 to 1737. Bouffier wrote much on a wide variety of subjects, But in this context, and perhaps quite generally, his most important work was entitled, or rendered in English, On First Truths and on the Origins of Our Judgments. This is a work of epistemology, theory of knowledge, and of metaphysics that engages in rather complex ways with the ideas of Descartes, Locke, and Berkeley. It's simply too elaborate to summarize, but the point to note here is that it introduces the idea, in response to skepticism, that particular judgments of perception and memory presuppose certain first principles of common sense that are not themselves open to serious doubt, since no proposition that could, if true, contradict them could ever be more credible than the principles themselves. Now that thought anticipates by 2 centuries ideas proposed by G. Moore and by Wittgenstein. But more immediately, it seemed to be close to what the Scottish common sense philosopher Thomas Reid advanced in his inquiry into the human mind on the principles of common sense, which was published in 1764, 20 or is it 40 years after Bouffier's work, and these are the pages of the two. This led to the English translation of Bouffier's text carrying an anonymous preface accusing Reid and others of the Scottish school of plagiarism. Reid responded indirectly in due course. The general consensus is that in his case, at least, in the case of Reid, the charge is unsubstantiated. The point remains, however, that in the modern sense of the expression, the philosophy of common sense, proposed as a response to skepticism, was first developed not by the Scottish Presbyterian minister Thomas Reid, but by the French Jesuit Claude Bouffier. Well, what's to count as a contribution and what's meant by philosophy? This question may not be as pedantic as it sounds. In reflecting on the examples I've given, one needs to distinguish, I think, between what I'll call contributions ad intra, that's to say ones that influenced or added to the practice of philosophy within Jesuit formation and teaching, and beyond that to the place of philosophy within the Catholic Church, and contributions ad extra, that's to say which made a difference to the study and practice of philosophy more broadly, or which could be invoked to do so. In that ad extra category, I would place some of Suarez's metaphysical ideas, in particular concerning causation and the relation of properties to their bearers. Again, this isn't the occasion to explore these matters, save to note that contemporary epistemology and metaphysics have difficulties giving account of our common non-scientific knowledge of natural causation, and of accommodating the fact that causation itself resists any general analysis. To a scholastic, this is hardly surprising, since the notion of cause is analogical, not univocal. But saying that does not of itself go very far. What we find in Metaphysical Disputations 17 to 19, in the treatment of efficient causation, is by contrast profound, and has things to contribute to contemporary debates. Beyond that, however, is the very general and important question of the relationship between observed characteristics and the natures of things, of which they are characteristics. Suarez writes, I'll just say this quickly, he writes, the accidental properties, especially those that follow upon or are owed to a substance by reason of its form, are caused by the substance, not only as a material cause and as a final cause, but also as an efficient cause through a natural resultance. It's probable, he continues, that the substantial form has a certain power for having its proper accidents emanate from it. Likewise, in this way, one discerns more clearly the natural connection between a substantial form and its properties, or we might say, between a substance and its properties. Now, I know this reads like a stock item of scholastic terminology, but it also points to a deep truth, which is that the relationship between proper accidents, propria, and natures is not a contingent one. Rather, the nature is the intelligible cause of the characteristics, and that explains how we can form conceptions of what things are on the basis of how they normally appear. As with Bouffier's account of knowledge, this idea can be deployed in defense of philosophical realism, the idea that the world is an intelligible structure and that we are equipped to make sense of that structure. A further distinction to be drawn in considering the character and significance of contributions philosophy is that measured by breadth of influence, which may yet not always be appreciated. With this in mind, let me return to the case. I'm just going to leave that there. I may or may not use this quotation. With this in mind, let me return to the case of recent Jesuits, considering Bernard Lonergan and contrasting him with the most famous academic ever to have been in the faculty of Heythrop. I might need to qualify that. One of the most famous academics ever to have been in the faculty of Heythrop, namely Frederick Copleston. In 1989-90, I submitted a nomination to the Secretary of the Honorary Degree Committee of the St Andrews Senate, proposing that Copleston be awarded a degree honoris causa for his contribution to philosophy through the study of its history. This was agreed and recommended without delay and with immediate and universal agreement. And that, I think, is due to the fact that Copleston's 9-volume History of Western Philosophy was a first and in many cases last work of reference for 2 or 3 generations of philosophers and philosophy students across the English-speaking world. It was viewed as reliable both because the author obviously knew a great deal about his subjects and because his method was one of impartial presentation. It would not be an exaggeration, I suspect, to say that for most Anglophone philosophy students between 1960 and 1980 who read any secondary literature on the history of philosophy, what they knew or believed they knew came either directly or indirectly from Copleston. And in reading him, or listening to their teachers who had read him, they were not only absorbing information about philosophers and their ideas, but acquiring a conception of how the history of philosophy should be done. It may have seemed common sense, but to those outside the Anglophone world who lived under the influence of ideological education, the situation was very different. And within the English-speaking world, a different approach was gaining ground, that associated with figures such as Alistair MacIntyre and Charles Taylor, who saw history of philosophy as partly cultural critique. The contrast I want to draw, however, is not that between Copleston and these later figures, but between him and Lonergan. The first, Copleston, had influence of the kind I described, sort of broad, not necessarily, very widely not necessarily acknowledged. He had that influence not through any, what we might call, original contribution in the obvious sense, while the latter, Lonergan, produced a monumental work that attracted disciples and has led to the establishment of dedicated societies, programs, and publications. I'm referring, of course, to Insight. Yet Lonergan's ad extra influence within professional academic philosophy has been negligible. Anyone who doubts this must consider the fact that the online Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is now the most widely consulted English language general work of reference for the subject, not only has no article on Lonergan, he isn't even mentioned anywhere among the 1,500 entries. While Copleston is cited in the references to entries on Aquinas, Descartes, Leibniz, Russell, Schopenhauer, the cosmological argument, and medieval philosophy. Now, I don't approve of this neglect, and I think it should be remedied, but it calls for an explanation. Lonergan's essays on St. Thomas's account of cognition, assembled under the title Verbum, Word and Idea in Aquinas, are in a way a return to the Jesuit Thomistic commentary tradition, and his essays on education are similarly in a Jesuit tradition dating back to Ignatius and Nadal. And both of these sets of writings are very good indeed. But it's quite another thing to venture out as an original philosopher, something which Copleston never sought to do. Lonergan may have been influenced by the example of de Chardin, I don't know. But to the eye of an analytical philosopher, both authors appear to tend to the application of a formula. And as G.K. Chesterton once observed, a pattern can stretch forever and still be a small pattern. De Chardin and Lonergan both attract devotees with many associations, publications, and activities dedicated to them. But in the world of academic philosophy, that's generally something to be wary of. For it's often a sign that people are treating an author as a sage or a guru, and not as a critical thinker. Copleston, by contrast, is underrated in being viewed as a mere chronicler of philosophy, for he was a thoughtful contributor to the philosophy of the history of philosophy, a point which is related to what I shall claim, as I draw to a conclusion now, is the perennial Jesuit contribution, the adaptation of philosophical thought to the circumstances and the needs of human life. Heythrop moved from the Cotswolds to Cavendish Square in 1970, being admitted to the Faculty of Theology in 71 and to that of Arts in 1974. In the intervening period, Copleston both served as principal and was awarded by the University the title Professor of the History of Philosophy. Retirement from the latter position came in 1974, when he also demitted the principalship. This short period meant that his professorial inaugural lecture in 1973 was, in effect, also a valedictory, and it bears the mark of recollection and reflection. That was apt, however, also because of its theme, the history of philosophy, relativism and recurrence, or recurrence. Copleston observed that when he embarked on the first volume of his History of Philosophy, he stated that he was approaching the subject from the perspective of, I quote, a scholastic philosopher, and that he then believed that Thomism is, and again I quote, a perennial philosophy. But over the course of that series, he'd come to think about the historical development and changing cultural role of philosophy in ways that moved him away from his original position. I spoke of the Jesuit habit of engaging and often adopting the ideas of a given period, and said that this has been viewed by some as accommodationism and criticised as a form of relativism. The analogous charge against Copleston's revised view would be that of historicism. But I think this misidentifies his position, just as the accusation of accommodationism often mischaracterizes practices of engagement and adoption. Now, these are large and contentious issues, but the point I want to press is that in his reflections on the history of philosophy in general, Copleston ascended from the position of being an accomplished historian of philosophical ideas to being a practitioner of the philosophy of the history of philosophy. And what he has to say in his inaugural lecture and subsequent publications is well worth considering and taking account of in assessing his contribution to philosophy ad extra. Finally, in his well-known book, The First Jesuits, and in writings on the development of the Ratio Studiorum, John O'Malley points out that the first Jesuits were subject through their education to both scholastic and humanistic influences, and these somewhat different approaches entered into the nature of the society. He traces that through different fields, principally those of ministry, worship, prayer, education, and culture. I think this is also a prominent feature of Jesuit contributions to philosophy. In his little book on Aquinas, G.K. Chesterton writes, "Since the modern world began in the 16th century, nobody's system of philosophy has really corresponded to everybody's sense of reality, to what, if left to themselves, common men would call common sense. Needless to say," he continues, "I am not so silly as to suggest that all the writings of St. Thomas are simple and straightforward in the sense of being easy to understand. The only point I'm stressing here is that Aquinas is almost always on the side of simplicity and supports the ordinary man's acceptance of ordinary truism." Well, to the extent that I have a thesis about what constitutes the unifying character of Jesuit contributions to philosophy, it is that, whether or not they are specifically Thomist, and if so, whether narrowly or broadly such, they're in the spirit of Aquinas, as Chesterton here characterizes that. On one level, this is to say that they're broadly realist, asserting the existence and intrinsic intelligibility of the real, and affirming the human capacity to know it. The efforts of Suarez and of Bouffier are but two important and indeed outstanding examples of that realism. But on the other hand, Jesuit contributions are generally marked by humanistic disposition, by which I mean a concern to articulate an ennobling conception of human nature as rational in cognition, in affection, and in action. In this regard, I think they are also heirs to an ancient conception of philosophy, namely as the practice of the love of wisdom. I don't want to be pious about this, either as a matter of declaring what philosophy must be, or attributing that conception to all notable thinkers. So in plainer terms, let me say there is a view which I believe I see in the work of Jesuit philosophers, which is that however far speculation may range, if it's to contribute to the human good, then it must return to inform the understanding of the human in relation to reality more generally, and engage with fundamental questions about practice and meaning. In this regard, philosophy, as studied and taught, is not an altogether autonomous exercise, since it contributes to a spiritual purpose. One characterized by Ignatius of Loyola when he wrote in his first annotation of the text of the spiritual exercises, and quote, "By the term spiritual exercises, we mean every method of examination of conscience, meditation, contemplation, vocal or mental prayer, and other spiritual activities, such as will be mentioned. For, just as taking a walk, traveling on foot, and running are physical exercises, so is the nature of spiritual exercises given to any means of preparing and disposing our soul to rid itself of all its disordered affections, and then, after their removal, of seeking and finding God's will in the ordering of our life for the salvation of our soul." Now, this is not to say that philosophy is just a form of spirituality, but unless it conduces in some way to a spiritual end, and indeed the particular one specified by Ignatius, then it's hard to see why a Jesuit qua Jesuit should be especially interested in it, or judge it necessary for his own education and desirable for the education of others to study, and where means and opportunity exist, to contribute to the practice of philosophy. It cannot, I think, be an accident that Ignatius and his confreres in the University of Paris all studied philosophy, or that the academic study of the subject has been a central part of Jesuit formation, and will, I hope, ever remain such. Thank you.